And the people in Europe who are going to be affected by it is us, not the Americans. The Americans can do many things. We will be in that crisis at a time when our economies are in crisis, our financial systems are in crisis. I was reading recently an analysis about how we have no plans in Europe about how to increase productivity, which in Europe has been falling. We are nowhere close to where the Americans and the Chinese are in developing the new technologies. We're in fact falling further and further behind. And if we have this crisis on top of that, then frankly, the outlook for Europe and its people is very bleak indeed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I want to make two more points just about the war of attrition.
Mm.
Uh, I believe that if you look at how the Russians have waged the war, they've waged it in a very sophisticated way. And the Ukrainians sometimes say that, including General Syrskyi. If you compare World War One to Russian strategy in this war, it's actually quite different. In World War One, both sides would take massive forces, get up out of the trenches, and attack head on into the teeth of well fortified defenses, and huge numbers of people would die. Think the Battle of the Somme,
Mm.
think Verdun, and so forth and so on. It was incredibly bloody. And in the process, the Allies and the Germans, whichever side was on the offensive to start with, ended up conquering very little territory. The front lines hardly moved at all. What the Russians have done is they have avoided, for the most part, frontal assaults, especially in more recent years. And they use clever tactics. This is not to say that they don't suffer significant casualties, because there's no way you can fight a war of attrition and not lose lots of people. But the Russians have not lost that many people. And they have not gained much territory in large part because they've not focused on that. They focused on using clever tactics to isolate the Ukrainian forces and kill more Ukrainian forces than kill Russian forces, right? So it's just very important that one not emphasize territory. Not that we were doing that, but many people on the outside do. Capturing territory is not the name of the game here. It's the casualty exchange ratio. And the Russians have done, I believe, as good a job as you can in minimizing casualties. Second point I'd make, just to go back to comparing World War One with the present war. If you look at 1918, in the spring of 1918, March 1918, the Germans launched the famous Ludendorff offensives. And it looked like the Germans might win the war in the spring of 1918. Remember, they had knocked the Russians out of the war in October of 1917. That's when the communists came to power, the Soviet Union came into being, and they dropped out of the war. And all those divisions that were on the Eastern Front were moved to the Western Front. So the Germans had a significant advantage in March 1918 when they launched the famous Ludendorff offensives. Those offensives failed, and by the summer, the Germans were in deep trouble. And of course, the war ended in November. Now, one of the key reasons that the Germans did not win the war was that the Americans came in. The Americans declared war in April of 1917, but they did not have substantial troops in Europe until the spring, late spring of 1918. And it was the coming of a massive American army, this infusion of infantry, this infusion, massive infusion of trigger pullers on the Allied side that convinced the Germans that they could not win the war after the Ludendorff offensives failed. Now, what about the present situation in Ukraine? The Americans are going in the other direction.
Yeah.
The Americans are not coming in. The Americans are pulling out. Just think of our discussion of security guarantees. Just think of Alexander's discussion of how secure the United States is, how it has that big ocean, how the United States can go cause trouble around the world, and then when things go south, just pull out. And it's still secure. But anyway, to go to Ukraine, we are slowly but steadily withdrawing our support for Ukraine, unlike the situation that you saw in 1918. And this is why I think Ukraine is doomed.
Uh, well, the Russians call it cauldrons when they do the semi or almost full encirclement of key strategic regions, and it's quite clever because these key regions, which are important to the Ukrainians, the Russians make sure that they get the main supply roads under fire control to make sure that there's heavy losses as they do their supplies in and out and rotation in and out of these cities or regions. Now, what you often see then is that the Ukrainians are rushing troops into these cauldrons in order to hold them, so they won't, the Russians won't have a breakthrough. And again, they take all these heavy losses only entering and leaving the city, only to find that the Russians are not really in a rush, that they create these scenarios or situations where they have very favorable attrition rates, where the Ukrainians are taking massive losses, and often they find the Russians don't seem to be in a rush to take these territories because this is an opportunity to grind down the Ukrainian army. So no, I don't know. I just feel we watch the same thing happen over and over again, and it doesn't seem to impact the narrative, which our politicians and media seems to push. That is, the Russians aren't able to take this territory. Well, they created a perfect scenario where the Ukrainians take huge casualties and the Russians have minimal. Why would they be in a rush? It's if we're allowed to say something positive about Russia in the West, we could admit that in a war of attrition, this is a clever move. But every narrative has to be that the Russians are stupid, they're having human waves, they don't care about lives, even though it's strategic to preserve life when you're in a war of attrition. I just wanted to, well, unless you have other comments on.
I'll just make one very quick comment about this, which is about rules of attrition. Now, I'm not, as I've said many, many times, a person with any sort of military background or a previous interest in military things. But one thing I have learned is the extent to which the Russians have an intellectual approach to war. I mean, this is what the general staff in Moscow is all about. It's got vast numbers of military academies and institutions and all kinds of things. And they are the sort of people who, more than perhaps you would find in militaries in other places, would probably look at a problem like the one that they were confronted in Ukraine initially, a very large country, a sophisticated and advanced country with relatively sophisticated armed forces. And they say to themselves, how ultimately are we going to win a war against an adversary like this? And you can imagine that they sat down and worked it out and planned it out in advance. It's not, I think, if you know how the Russian military system functions, it's not, I think, completely surprising that they do that. I mean, the amount of time and resources and energy they give to thinking about war is very unlike what we see in the West. It's the one thing they do very well.
The other thing I would say,
Mm,
Alexander, is that all armies learn in the
yeah.
course of a war. So if you look at the Russian army in 2022, it was a much less effective fighting
Yes.
force than it is today.
Mm,
Because again, armies learn. I've looked at the Soviet performance in World War II,
mm,
and the exchange ratio in terms of lost armored vehicles in 1941. This, of course, is when Barbarossa took place from June 22nd, 1941 to December 8th, 1941. The exchange ratio in lost armored vehicles was about 7-1 in the Germans' favor. In other words, the Soviets lost, the Red Army lost 7 armored vehicles for every one that the Germans lost. By 44, late 1944, early 1945, the ratio is about 1-1,
yeah.
close to 1-1. The Soviets have really learned how to fight those panzer divisions. They've gotten much more effective. Now you say to yourself, John, well, what about the Ukrainians? Don't they learn as well? I do think the Ukrainians have learned. And if you listen to them talk, they've
Mm,
learned for sure. But the problem is their military has been hollowed out.
yeah.
It's not that they haven't learned, it's that the fighting forces, as we've talked about with regard to their infantry, have reached the crisis point. They're not able to train forces. They recruit people and basically ship them to the front lines. This is a disastrous situation. The Russians, on the other side, not only have been learning, but their forces are anything but hollowed out. They've raised huge numbers of forces. That rather small and not terribly effective Russian army of 1922, excuse me, of 2022, is a much bigger army today and a much more effective army. And I think this explains a lot about where the war is heading these days and where it's likely to head moving forward.
Yeah.
So, well, we all seem to think this is going to end in a war going to end on the battlefield, or at least more pressure is going to have to be. The Europeans going to have to come under greater pressure before accepting these very harsh terms of the Russians. What I find interesting with the territorial issue, though, is the argument is they can't walk out of Donbass, the territory which the Russians do not hold yet, because this is where all the great front lines are, and but also or the great defensive lines. Because from what I understand, the Russians would be willing to make some freeze the front lines or change the borders of Kherson and Zaporizhia, but Donetsk they want everything. However, every day that passes, this will be less painful, I guess, because more territory will fall to the Russians. Not so there will be less to give up in Donetsk, but at the same time, the Russians will then begin to take more out of Zaporizhia, especially if they now open up this front line, which there's been a lot of talk about. Well, I guess to some extent they already are. Um, so, but Yeah, I want to just I guess my last issue I wanted to ask the both of you was where do we go next in this diplomatic efforts by Trump? I'm not sure if he really believes in it or not, but again, the first step was Trump Putin. The second was Trump Zelensky plus his European entourage. And next one would be either Putin Zelensky or Putin Zelensky and Trump. But do you see this moving forward? And or again, if his main goal is to tell people what they want to hear, so he tells Europeans and Russians two different things, won't this all fall apart when he brings the two parties together?
Well, I would ask you, Glenn, what's the deal here? I mean, what's the compromise deal that both sides can agree to? For Trump to bring them together assumes that you're going to get some sort of agreement. I don't see any basis for an agreement. So why do you think there's any chance of this working?
I I agree, Glenn.
No, no. Well, this is why I do think that both of these meetings could go well. Now did go well because he could, as you suggested before, he could tell the Russians what they wanted to hear. He could tell the Europeans more or less what they wanted to hear, except for the ceasefire. But I don't think it would go well at all with meeting both Zelensky and Putin because, well, they're too far apart. And I
There's
think,
no deal here, Glenn. There's
yeah,
just no deal.
no, exactly. So it looks like this would blow up in his face. And the idea that they would be rushed ahead before, I mean, why would they meet if there's not a deal in place? Putin and Zelensky aren't negotiators. It's very strange to me that, isn't this the last step of negotiation? You bring in the big guys to shake hands and sign some papers, but what about the small guys, the ones who actually hatch out the deals? They seem to have skipped that whole part, which is a bit strange.
Well, I don't know that there's going to be any serious meeting between Putin and Zelensky. I think Putin can conduct a negotiation. I think he's the sort of person who would be very good at negotiation. I think Zelensky is capable of conducting an effective negotiation for exactly the reasons that John basically pointed to, which is that any negotiation at this stage of the war would require Zelensky to make concessions to the Russians on core issues, at least core issues for him, which he is not capable of making. The only way, I mean, that there could be a peace agreement of any kind would be as a result of a complete change of power in Kiev. Zelensky himself goes, somebody completely different takes his place and negotiates an agreement very much along the lines that the Russians set out in their terms of 14th of June 2024, and accepts that the Ukraine that comes out of this crisis is going to be one which, to a greater or lesser extent, is going to be a bit like Finland after the Second World War in the Russian sphere of influence. Now, that is a very, very tall order. I mean, even if you could remove Zelensky from the scene, there's no guarantee that you could control the outcome in Kiev. So, unless there is major diplomatic pressure by the Americans, by the Americans and the Europeans working together to control what happens in Kiev, to try and bring about a change there, trying to get somebody completely different to take over. I can't really see the negotiation working out at all. I think all of this talk about a trilateral meeting and a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and holding it in Rome or holding it in Geneva or holding it in some other place, Budapest, I believe, is the latest place that they're talking about. I don't think this remotely addresses the core problem, which is that these two men are so far apart
Yeah.
that there just isn't any way that they can agree, even if this meeting happens. And Zelensky himself is not going to be capable of conducting a coherent negotiation.
Yeah, and you want to remember when we started the program, we were talking about security guarantees
Yeah,
and all the grand schemes that are being floated. Those security guarantees make it even more difficult to
yeah,
compromise.
yes.
The situation's just getting worse, right, in terms of reaching some sort of deal. Uh, and again, as I think we all agree, this one's going to be settled on the battlefield, and the end result is not going to be pretty for Europe, as Alexander was articulating earlier.
Yeah, this is the part that is very infuriating because this is, for all this talk, or all these years about wanting to stand with Ukraine and all this supposed empathy, this is going to destroy Ukraine, though. Not only will they take huge casualties at the last stages of this war as things begin to collapse, they will lose more territory, they will lose more infrastructure, the ability to recover at all for Ukraine to actually survive as a nation. All of this will be undermined now. There's nothing to rebuild if you don't put an end to this. This is going to be, well, I think, John, you referred to it as in the past as a very ugly piece if it is finished on the battlefield. Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is what's going to happen, and it's just the rhetoric you get here in Europe versus the actual reality of what they're doing. It just seems like they're oceans apart, though.
And the damage that's been done to the European economies, especially the German economy. I mean, it's not only the Ukrainians who are losers here, it's also the Europeans.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, the Europeans have lost nowhere near as much as the Ukrainians have, but the Europeans have lost here. This is going to do significant damage to NATO. And you have Donald Trump in the White House. Is he going to help Ukraine recover in the years ahead? Is he going to send lots of largesse, lots of money to Ukraine to help Ukraine recover from this war? I would not bet a lot of money on this. This is a catastrophic situation for Ukraine. And the idea that continuing this war is going to rescue the situation for them, it's just not a serious argument. But people like us can't sell that logic, can't sell that set of facts to people on the outside for the most part.
I agree with that. I mean, I have nothing really to add to that. Um, we have experienced the greatest failure in European statesmanship since the end of the Second World War. I mean, it has been a disaster, and it's getting worse. And one can see that all the pieces are falling into place to make that disaster happen. I don't. To come back to the earlier points, I don't think there is going to be a diplomatic solution to this war. As I said, it would require too much to happen in Kiev, in Europe, for that to be possible.
Any last words? John.
I'm out of words.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Well,
I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
All these shows end on such a depressing note, but I think, if you're operating in a reality-based world, it's hard not to be pessimistic in the extreme.
Yes.
but one little positive note there though would be the Trump's efforts to normalize the bilateral relations with Russia. Again, I don't exclude some deception here. That is that he still would like to, outsource a lot of the hostility to the Europeans. So if he sells the weapons, Americans will still provide the intelligence, logistics, some targeting. So it's not as if they're divorced, but the efforts nonetheless to have improved relations between the United States and Russia, I think this is great news for everyone. If you have the two world's largest nuclear powers, two of the three major great powers in the world, now being able to sit down and talk to each other, which apparently wasn't possible for 3 years, I think the world is a much safer place. So, that's at least something, if we're looking desperately for some, ending on a good note. So